So I don't want to take too much time, but just to remind you that TOBY defined national science policy as a set of federal rules, regulations, methods, practices, and guidelines under which scientific research is conducted. And obviously this is the scientific policy module, so this is relevant. And just to remember that science and policy are interconnected, and the two concepts that Toby brought up, science for policy, which is scientific findings used to develop public policy, and policy for science, which is government laws, regulations, and policies that affect the practice of science. So as from what I've seen from your topics, you may be doing science for policy if you're working on specific topics. If you're working on STEM education, that's more policy for science. So you probably will be seeing all of these things in the course. So one of the things, when you think about the actual science of science policy, so you may have seen this book, it's one of the classics, the context, and it's interesting to look at this because it is a science. It's not as much studied as other ones have been, but thinking really analytically about the science of science policy will be important as we go through the course. So this is sort of developing into more of a community of practice now of folks who are actually studying this. So that's something to consider. And the goals of the science for science policy are to develop evidentiary basis to help policymakers make decisions, build a community between policymakers and researchers. There's also economic considerations, as well as what sort of investments need to be made in science to remain innovative. And the recent landscape today, this field is really based on using scientific approaches to develop consensus, to inform and provide knowledge to policymakers, and inform how they make policy decisions. So how do we think about science contributing to the policymaking process, and how does it work? So in general, you want to think about the goal of good policy should be to improve the overall welfare of society. And as you'll see, just to give you a little bit of a flavor of how this works, science policy is a product of multiple inputs, mechanisms, and interactions. There are many different entities, such as executive agencies, congressional committees, and also it occurs through a number of mechanisms and, for example, legislation and other ways. The way that policy is implemented is also complicated and occurs on multiple levels. Budget, for example, is one, but that's really only one way to do it. And then on top of that, once the policy is established, it can be also interpreted multiple ways, which can also lead you to go back to have to go back and reiterate the policy. So it's a very complicated process. There's a lot of different steps. I won't read through this whole quote here, but it just basically says that it's very complex at every level, and all the levels are interconnected as well. So this is sort of what that looks like when you're thinking about policy making in the real world. This is what we call the science policy web, which is there's a lot of different players. As we'll see in the class, policy is a collaborative process, and it works by decision making as a collective. A lot of the projects that we'll do are in teams, but this is also how it works in the real world. And you have to be able to develop consensus on a specific policy and come to a collective decision, which isn't always easy. So as you can see in this web diagram, science policy is pluralistic in nature. So that means it takes into account many different views, and it's obviously supported by multiple agencies and overseen and funded by multiple congressional committees. And at the center of the web are key offices, White House offices, such as OSDP and OMB, federal agencies, committees, subcommittees, and also scientific interests that are represented by specific groups, universities, as well as NGOs like the national academies, for example. And the press, as you can see, the media connects all of these to each other. And the groups that are sort of outside are, again, universities, industries, national labs, societies, governments, and also the general public, which will be come into play as well. And as you can imagine here, all of the groups at the center of the web are continuously influenced by interactions by those in the outer thread. So again, it ends up being a very complicated process, but just to give you a little flavor of that. And where policy actually occurs. So you know about the 3 branches of government where laws are made in the legislative branch, carried out in the executive branch, and then the judicial branch evaluates the laws. And as I showed you in the previous slide, there's a lot of different groups at all these levels. There are a number of different ways that you can influence policy. So I won't go through this, but I wanted to just give you a little bit of an idea of how all these different things work and come together. And so the last couple of slides, just to get a little bit more practical, when you're thinking about how do you actually make policy and compare policies to each other, which as you'll be doing in the class, this is one of the processes that you might go through when you want to identify a goal or a problem you want to solve, and then diagnose the problem, think about what societal benefit can your issue lead to, and how can you diagnose this, what sort of behavior needs to change to be able to act on the problem. And then you want to identify the appropriate institution for action. So who is really the person that you want to go to be able to impact the policy, and then evaluate the policy options that you have, which takes into account a lot of different factors. And then you want to implement, enforce, and monitor the policy changes, which again, there are some practical things to think about here as far as the policies being able to be implementable as well as politically relevant. So this is sort of the policy making process. And then once you get to sort of towards the end of this, and again, you'll be doing a lot of this is sort of comparing different policy options to each other and trying to put forth a position that you have on something. And so this is a good book that talks about analysis. And this is sort of takes it a little bit farther to where you want to think about it's sort of similar to what I described, but the problem that you are looking at is, what is the framing of the problem within the political context? What kind of evidence do I need to put forth a certain position? What kind of alternatives might there be to my specific position? And then you want to select the criteria that you can use to, again, pick one over the other. Think about what kind of outcomes you might have specifically on the stakeholders that you're trying to impact. You'll have probably a number of different types of options, and all of them will have pluses and minuses. So looking at the trade-offs and really analyzing different criteria. And then you really at the end need to pick a position, sort of narrow down and decide on which way you want to go from there. And then be able to communicate it, which again, we'll also talk about this later in the course as far as how do you communicate your position to a policymaker. So